Good afternoon, everybody. We're joined by Alan Hill, who's been writing blogs for us in the FX blog section. Alan is the lead consultant at treasuryconsultancy.com. He's located in the UK, and he's written a lot over the past few months on Brexit and the pound, and so it works out really well that he's joined with us today because it's been really active in the pound. Alan, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks very much, Mike. Thanks for asking me to join you.
Yeah, well, we had it planned on the books for a few days, and as it turns out, it's been a really volatile day, a really volatile week regarding the pound and the Brexit, and so we're hoping to get more information on that. But I thought that
Sure.
we'd start out before we jump into that on if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, sure. I worked in my first bank trading room in 1990 at Manufacturers Hanover Trust, well-known American bank then. And I went through the mergers that they went through with first into Chemical Bank, where I had my first trading position. I traded Scandinavian currencies interbank there. And then they joined with Chase Manhattan Bank. And before they joined JP Morgan, I left. I went overseas for a few years. I went and worked in the Middle East for about 12 years. I was 7 years in Saudi Arabia, 3 in Dubai, and the last couple of years in Qatar. My background before I went into trading was with the Middle East. I was treasurer for a Saudi-owned investment house in the UK for 5 years in the mid-90s, early mid-90s, and that's where I got my trading experience. I was very lucky to be given the opportunity to travel to New York. I spent 6 months in New York in Goldman Sachs trading room, where my boss and my mentor at the company I worked for, he had a very good relationship with senior people there, and he got me an internship for 6 months, which I really enjoyed. That gave me a very good grounding. When I came back to London, I started trading on their behalf, and I wanted to get back into banking, so that was when I joined Mantrust. So I went through quite a lot of interesting times with in the trading area in the 90s, and then, as I say, I moved overseas in 2002.
Interesting. Yeah, you've been all over. That's interesting. Also in the Middle East, that experience. We'll definitely talk about that another time. Um,
So
so, so how do you look for opportunities with your, extensive background? Like, how do you look for opportunities in the currency markets?
Well, I'm very much into fundamental analysis. As I said to you offline earlier, I don't get a lot of time these days to study charts very much. I've never been particularly a technical trader anyway. I look for opportunities in what I see and what I read. I mean, I'm quite a voracious reader. I read a lot about markets and what's going on, and just build up pictures in my head. That's what I think is an important thing. That's what I learned, very much in my formative years, that you build pictures of what you expect the market to be doing. And just as I said earlier, I mean, that's something that I've done just recently. I have a position running at the moment in sterling versus the Australian dollar, and I tend to pick things like that because I see. I see an opportunity that I firmly believe, as you know from reading my blogs, that sterling is going to go appreciably lower at some point, irrespective of what sort of Brexit it is. We'll talk about that in a minute, obviously. And the Australian dollar, I felt, was very much overdone with regard to the trade war and what was going to happen with that. And luckily, that's starting to pan out. But that's the sort of thing I do. I build pictures of what I see of the market, what I think the market's going to do. I'm not necessarily counter intuitive in that way, but I tend to just look for what I think is the story that's happening at that time.
Interesting. And, being that you've been trading for a long time, how do you think the market has changed over your career?
Well, certainly with regard to pricing, I mean, it's the spreads that you can get these days are absolutely ludicrous. I mean, when I first started trading, you couldn't get a spread less than 5 pips in cable at all anywhere. Even if you were Citibank dealing with Chase, that was the spread, and that was it. Now, what is it, 0.3 of a pip on most occasions? That's changed out of all recognition, and obviously that's the technology that's done that far more than anything else. And I think banks have changed in their methodology. Clearly, the financial crisis had a big effect, but general risk management has changed things quite a lot. So banks are looking less at risk taking and more at product, and they look at liquidity provision as obviously a large product for them. So it's becoming a pyramid game, and everyone in the end deals with maybe half a dozen banks. That everything gets put together into maybe half a dozen banks who clear all the trades that go on in the world, and that's where they see their profitability. They don't sit with a euro dollar trader, a sterling trader, a Swiss franc trader, a yen trader, all trying to make money off their own back. They're just trying to see as much business as they can, as much flow as they can, and that goes both. I have some experience in treasury sales as well, and that overflows it from between both the interbank market, where they're trying to get non-bank FIs to deal with them, and into the sales force as well.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, the market's definitely changed, looking at the technology, and like you said, it's going through a lot less money centers, things like that. So,
absolutely, yeah.
Take us through living in London, the whole Brexit experience over the last few years, and where we stand and what you think on, the Brexit situation.
Okay, right. First, I don't live in London. I live about, 200 miles west of London now. I obviously did live in London when I was trading, and I worked in the city. But I live down in the west of England now, where we as a region were very Remain driven. I mean, both the two large counties, Devon and Cornwall in the west of the country, both voted Remain. But that was different to the rest of the country. Personally, I mean, I voted Leave when the referendum took place, and over the ensuing almost couple of years now, I've kind of changed my mind. Although I still think Leave was the best thing to do. I do think that the UK will thrive outside the EU in time. I think short term it's going to be a disaster, but over a generation, I think it will be seen as the correct thing to have done. But I think the vote was very much a locally driven affair. So, for example, if you live in an area where there is hugely high immigration and you can't get your kids into a school, or you can't get your young ones into a nursery, or you can't get a doctor's appointment or a hospital appointment, then you would be more inclined to vote Leave, because you saw that as your primary driver for doing that. If you lived in the city of London, where it's very cosmopolitan, and then you're used to sitting on a bus and 20 people speaking 20 different languages, it's a different event. And I think it's that very dichotomy is what split the country in two. It's not a party political issue. It's very much a social issue, and that's something that has interested me as well. I think that there were two very, very large fundamental mistakes made by the government very early in the Brexit process. First, Theresa May did not appoint a Brexit commission. There should have been a commission created, which had 10, 12 constituents who were not MPs and were all interested, not necessarily rabid Leave voters, but interested in the process of leaving the EU, and they could then have deliberated, had negotiated, then come back to Parliament with a Brexit plan and put that through, and then Parliament could have debated it, and there we'd have had a much more concise view on what we needed to do leaving Brexit. And the other thing that's happened is that it was allowed to become a party political issue. So you have on the one side you have the government, the Conservative Party, who are having to drive this Brexit process, whereas they've always been the party of trying to leave Europe. They also have a fair number of members of Parliament who are actually pro-Europe. And the same is on the other side of the coin as well. The Socialist Labour Party, they are basically the party trying to just upset the government. They don't have a Brexit plan as such, but they are, because they see it as their responsibility to basically counter everything the government does. Every time the government puts a policy forward, irrespective if it's thought to be a good policy or a bad policy, the Labour Party votes against it, because that's what they will do. And they've already come out and said that they will vote against whatever the government put in front of the members of Parliament, or in front of Parliament, when the deal is done, because they are the opposition and that's what they have to do. Whereas in their ranks, they will have an equal number probably of Leave candidates and Remain candidates, and that is why there's always a big debate about whether a member of Parliament actually represents his constituency, or is actually their delegate. So does he make his own mind up on their behalf, or does he act on behalf of his constituents, listening to what they have to say? And that is where Brexit's gone wrong. They are the two fundamental issues: a Brexit Commission and the party politicisation of the whole Brexit process.
Yeah. So where do you think we are now, and what do you think is going to happen over the next month or two?
Well, I'm becoming basically more pessimistic as the days go by. I think it's a far more likely we are far more likely now to see a hard or no deal Brexit take place than we are to see a deal, simply because neither side can actually can give up any more ground. You have the EU on one side, where you have basically Juncker, Barnier, and Tusk, who they basically represent the European Parliament in this matter, and they are far more interested in the integrity of the EU, i.e., these are the treaties, this is the policies, this is what we do. We have the Lisbon Treaty in place, so this is how a country trying to leave the EU will work. Whereas it should be, and it needs to be, a more practical approach, a more pragmatic approach, let's say, where case by case, it's a different thing. Because if Italy or Spain or Greece, for that matter, were trying to leave the EU, sorry, excuse me, it would be a vastly different process to the UK leaving, primarily because of the value to the EU of those countries. The UK is of great value to the EU, just if no other reason, financially, because we make a large contribution to the net budget every year. We are contributors in so many different ways, and that is a different methodology to what we'd expect if, say, Italy were leaving. But because of the Lisbon Treaty and the way the EU is set up, everyone is treated the same.
Yeah. So,
So, sorry, I was going to go on to say, so do you think that it's a hard Brexit is becoming more likely, and the impact will be as severe on a lot of European manufacturers as it is on UK manufacturers. UK manufacturing, I think, will take the hit first, but I think the longer lasting effect will be on Europe.
Interesting. And based on I know you've been bearish the pound based off of what you are talking about here. Is there a chance that the pound doesn't go down, even if these sort of this sort of outcome plays out, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I've been in this market a long time, as I said at the start, and there is no such thing as a sure thing, obviously. But I don't see. Take it back. I've got an example. I used to work a late shift when I was at Chemical Bank. I used to do the overnight hours on occasion, and I was working the night that the UK left the exchange rate mechanism of the exchange rate mechanism, sorry, of the EU, when it was loosely tied to each currency was loosely tied to each other and couldn't deviate more than a certain amount, and the UK had inflation of 16%, and it was tied to a Deutschmark which had inflation of, let's say, 2.5%. So there was a massive dichotomy between the two, and sterling was under enormous pressure, and eventually had to leave the EU, or leave the ERM, and that was pretty much a certainty. But this government still battled like crazy to try and keep the UK within those confines it was supposed to be within. And I think that's where we are right now. I think the government will try to do everything it possibly can. And Theresa May today has said that they have treated the EU with the utmost respect, and it hasn't been reciprocated. Now that's as maybe, and that may be the case. It may not be the case. But I think there's certainly been a far greater degree of intransigence from the EU than has been from the UK, simply because they stand by their rules and will not budge. But where we are right now is, I think that sterling comes down to, I don't know, what have I got in front of me? I've got a cable chart in front of me now. I think 127 is the very minimum we can see. And I think as this weekend, it always happens over weekends. because there's so much goes on in the UK. The UK has the same as the US does to a certain extent. Has these all the politicians like to talk to the newspapers, and particularly the Sunday newspapers. There's always dramas going on Sundays, and the political shows are on TV. So there's something that's going to come out over this weekend. I would say, there's going to be probably Johnson will make another attack on May this weekend. Because of what's gone on, and the deal's not going to get done, etc., etc. And I just think you add the politics and Brexit together, I think sterling comes down at least to 127 over the next couple of months.
Interesting. So, I'm actually getting a question coming in. Somebody's asking, does Alan see some sort of fiscal unity emerging in the EU to solve monetary issues?
I wrote about that earlier in the week. I do see a closer harmony within the EU, and I know that's what Mario Draghi was calling for in a speech he made earlier this week. Germany is enormously against that, but because their position has been weakened, because it looks like Jens Weidemann isn't going to be replacing Mario Draghi as the ECB president. Their position has been weakened. And if it's a Frenchman or a French person who comes in, because Macron is so in favour of that, I do believe there will be a fiscal joining of hands, as it were, across the EU, across the Eurozone anyway. I certainly think it makes sense for them. What the EU can't do, or the Eurozone can't do right now, is stay as it is. It cannot just simply tread water. It has to go forward with joint taxation, joint fiscal policies, and a joint military force as well, because there is no point to the EU staying as it is right now. So in answer to the caller's question, yes, I do think there will be a fiscal line up, as it were, across the Eurozone.
What would be the impact of, if we were to see a significant sell-off in the pound, down to the low 120s, potentially even below 120, when initially we got that vote a few summers ago, we saw a move from 150, and at one point we had a spike low below 120. What do you think the impact would be if we were to really get a move lower in the pound?
Well, certainly much, much higher inflation, which will cause a big problem to the Bank of England, because the Bank of England will be if it goes as badly as it can go, which is becoming possible. I wouldn't say likely, but it can go badly. But whether it can go as badly as it possibly can, then the two rate hikes that have taken place already this year will have to be reversed. Inflation could get to 4.5% easily, no question. And the UK economy will suffer because austerity is still being used by the government in the public sector, and private investment is going to just drain away.
Excuse me. Yeah, well, the volatility in the pound, we actually have kind of settled around this 130 level for roughly 12 months now, give or take 4 or 5 big figures. That's really going to be interesting. I know that we got some interesting votes coming up and a lot of political talk. This week, the pound has been kind of front and center, Brexit talk front and center. I know you guys are on top of it over there. It'll be interesting to see what kind of headlines come over the weekend and what that leads to next week. Just looking at price action yesterday, this week we saw stronger retail sales, higher CPI, and at the beginning of the week, more positive Brexit talk, and that took the pound up over 133. I have a chart up for everybody to see. It was just about 8 weeks ago or 6 weeks ago, we were trading below 127. We rallied up to 133 yesterday. Now on today's news, we're back below 131. So it's front and center. It's everybody's looking at it. Is there anything over the coming 4 or 5 days that we should be looking for, or is it just more off the cuff kind of comments?
Well, I think it will be off the cuff, because that's what it is, because there is no plan. That's the issue. I mean, Theresa May comes back to the UK from Salzburg and makes a speech damning the hierarchy of the EU, but she has no alternative other than the Chequers proposals, which have been basically slaughtered by everybody. If she continues to use that as her benchmark without any changes at all, and taking into account particularly the Leave campaigners in her own party who've come up with their own Irish border issue solution, then it is going to just get worse, because she is going to become more and more isolated, and there will be a leadership challenge, which is a further issue, of course, on top of everything else.
Yeah. I just wanted to update for everybody also. Right now in crude, basically there's some rumors that came out before talking about possibly adding more, about 500,000 barrels in OPEC, so that we've had a significant move there. Traded up to 71.80. We're now trading on the low at 70.11. So that's been the volatile move on this OPEC, supposedly OPEC and non-OPEC countries upping their production. But, Alan, back to the pound, back to UK, thanks a lot for joining us. It's definitely front and center. We'd like to have you back maybe next week to give us a update, because there's definitely a quick, fast-moving story. Even as we speak, I'm seeing Netherlands PM says EU would still like to make a Brexit deal, but UK needs to make a step. There's so much back and forth, so many headlines.
Absolutely, and of course you've got one country dealing with 28 now, others, and they've all got their own agendas, and that's what makes the EU such an unwieldy beast.
Yeah, exactly, and that's part of the whole Brexit thing from the beginning. It's just so many different countries, so many different political systems all coming together in one.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely, yeah. But we'll see how it goes. I think it's a difficult one, and I think that you're always going to get counter moves. I mean, the pound's come to where it is now. If Barnier was come out in the next hour or so and say, well, we're trying hard to make an agreement, you'd probably see maybe 50, 60 points higher in the pound. Who knows? But that's the sort of thing that's going on. But the overall trend is clearly lower, and I think that's where we're headed.
Yeah, you've been making that clear, and that's very interesting. So this is Alan Hill, lead consultant at treasuryconsultancy.com, and Alan's been posting blogs in our FX blog section nearly daily, so you can take a good look at all that stuff. Alan, thanks a lot for joining us, and we'll definitely chat next week. Definitely want a pound and a Brexit update, as it's front and center right now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Mike. I'll be writing something over the weekend, which you'll be able to post on Monday anyway. So that'll give a bit of an update of what we've seen so far, okay?
Great. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Alan.